Right, shalom, shalom.
Oh, hello. How's everything? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can, you're a little muffled, just a little bit.
A little bit muffled. Is it better now?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, pretty good. Can you hear me pretty good?
You might be muted now.
Hold on. Hold on. Sorry about that. All right, is it better now?
Yeah, I can't hear you.
You can, yeah? You're good? Okay. So let's give it a second, let a couple other people come in. So yeah, so we gotta touch on this week's tour portion,
See, brother, are you
which
there?
yeah. You can't hear me? What about now? Can you hear me now? No. What about now? Can you hear me now? Wow. All right, you can you hear me now? You haven't heard me this whole time, no?
No, I couldn't hear you. You just came back on.
No. So wait, you can't hear me at all, right? You're saying no, you can't hear me? Oh, let me type it.
Sorry.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. So okay. Okay, so is it okay if we start or should we wait?
One second. I think you're muted again.
No, I haven't said anything. I was saying, is everybody, are you ready to go on your side?
Oh, yes, yes, sir. One
Oh,
day.
okay. All right, cool. All right, so we'll just go into it. So anyway, we're gonna just kind of touch on this week's tour portion, which is not just a tour portion; it's also the beginning of an entire book in this concept of bar midbar, right? In to really connect to the journey, right? We started with Genesis, Bereshit, and we went into the book of Shemot, and then we went into Leviticus, and Vayikra, and now we're over here by Bar Midbar, right? And so at this point in the journey, at this point in the journey, um, Can you hear me okay? Because someone just called me. Can you hear me all right? All right, great.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, cool, cool. Because sometimes, like if someone calls you, I don't know. I had that problem before. Like I was like talk, I didn't say anything for like whatever. Anyways, okay. So the point is just saying. So we want to touch on this idea of bar midbar. We're entering a new book. It's the fourth book of the Torah, and we've been on this amazing journey of story, of depth, of understanding, the whole thing, right? And so, this idea of bar midbar is this process of them going towards the Holy Land, right? And so, I want us to really just kind of like just think about that, reflect on that idea of, first you have the process of Moshe coming to them, right? And saying there's a different way of living, there's a different life, we have a different calling, we are supposed to do more than this in life. And the people are kind of like, all right, cool. He said, don't worry about it, I'm going to talk to Pharaoh. Right? So he goes, he talks to Pharaoh, he gets rejected. But over time, the people start witnessing these plagues, right? These different makot, these different things that are happening. And so this starts to change the nature of everybody. I mean, it for sure changes the nature itself, but it really starts to change the nature or the perception of everyone around. And so this process happens, and the apex of it is them, ultimately leaving, on this very holy night, and and the story continues, and then this whole Yom Suf. So what we're saying is just like we went through all these different stages, emotionally, spiritually, and we connected ourselves to it in this whole process, right? But we have to, look back, right? We have to look back because, when you start a new book or you start something new, it's like the new moon itself, right? It's like when they first sight the moon, it's just a small like, slither, right? It's like a small like, little thing, right? And and so the whole process of the moon or at least that doesn't come for another 15 days. So like at the beginning of something, it's a good time to reflect backwards, right? When you start something new, like a lot of times, as companies grow, they read their, original mission statement, right? Because they want to go back to that place of clarity that led them to this particular, you know, moment, right? And so when we're looking back, we're looking back at all this growth, right? We're looking at this aspect of the whole dynamic of going on tour, going Mountain Torah, right, which we're preparing ourselves for, and that process of building the Mishkan, right, and building the whole infrastructure, that would be replicated, in Jerusalem, right, with the different camps, you saw in the video. And so that process is what we're experiencing in that now, and then we're going now into this process of in the Torah of life after that, right? So that in itself is something to reflect on, right? The fact that as we prepare for Matan Torah, we're reading about the leaving of Matan Torah, right? Leaving from that experience toward the next phase, right? So as we are preparing ourselves for Shavuot, right, in this super connection, and we'll start going into the halakha and the halakot for it, as I'm sure you guys are already experts on it. But we're going to just review that a little bit. But the point is just saying that process of Shavuot is that connection to, our purpose, right? Is connected to, like, when the Jewish people stood on Mount Sinai, what it connected them to was it allowed them to understand why they went through every hardship prior. It allowed them to understand why they were there at that moment, and then it gave them an insight to their future in terms of their destination, right? And so in Mountain Torah, we should get. I mean, it depends. Everyone at their own level, right? Everyone's gonna connect to different levels, but that is the download, right? And that download is directly connected to the Exodus that happened 7 weeks prior. And then also you got to keep in mind too that it's the death anniversary of David Melech, right? Of King David, right? His death anniversary is the night of Shavuot, which is the 50th night of the Omer, right? So you have a lot of, like, massive connections, but the point of that moment is to go into the place of Israel, to get that clarity, to be able to say, okay, you know what? Now that I understand why I went through everything, it makes total sense. Why I understand why I'm standing here in front of God right now, and I understand what I'm supposed to be doing, what my future generations are supposed to be doing. I get it. So from that standpoint, is to say that, okay, well, now that I have that download, now that I have no doubt in my mind about who I am, and what I'm supposed to do, and what God's potential for me is. Like, I have an inkling of it, right? And I understand even that is beyond my logic. I can't see my future, right? I only can see an inkling, right? Just like Rosh Chodesh, right? That's coming up. Or are we in it now, actually? Um, no. We got a couple of days. Yeah, Wednesday. Wednesday's Rosh Chodesh. Yeah, I mean, everything time was like such a random. Like today, I just felt like all day today. I felt like it was like Friday, like I feel like it was before Shabbat earlier today, and then later on in the day, I felt like it was like Sunday, like right after. I don't know. So I don't know. I'm having this kind of like unique experience with time right now. But either way, the point is just saying, in the same way that we only have inklings during Rosh Chodesh, is the same way we have inklings, about our future, but enough to go forward, right? And so that's what Bar Midbar represents, is that idea of going forward after the download, right? And what are you going into it after the download? And that process is the next leg of the journey, right? Because the download is one level. Yes, from Pesach to here, we jumped off on Purim. We went we went extra high on Purim, and then we made our way to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and eventually to the 14th, the 15th of Nisan, and and then now we're here, and we had Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and Pesach Sheni, and Loch Omer, right? We had all these, like, amazing jump offs, and so now, we got Rosh Chodesh Sivan coming up Wednesday, and from there, from there, we're going into Shavuot, right? And we're going into Shavuot after 6 days after that, and that's the connection, right? So the point is saying that's the deal. All right. So what we're going to learn today, we're going to learn a little bit of Rabbi Sachs, because he does such a great job with bringing out really key points, right? And so he's going to bring out some really key points, some really great questions, and we're going to learn a couple other points on the style of teaching, right? Because we have to learn about that too. And so that's where we're at, right? That's where we're at. We're diving into Bar Midbar. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking. It's the journey after the download, right? And that's where we're going to be at very soon. And so, in a way, God, the way the Torah is structured is like kind of like preparing us for that next stage now. Even though we're totally amped up and we can't wait to, knock down the doors of Shavuot. We at the same time, there's a world after that, and that's also part of leadership too, right? Because we got to be thinking ahead and preparing everybody. Okay, so Rabbi Sek says like this. Okay, Bar Midbar, right? So some people say Bar Midbar means wilderness, and then some people say desert, right? So that's like a whole thing. That's like a whole conversation in itself, right? Because those are two distinctly different environments. Okay, so it says like this: leading a nation of individuals. Okay, very nice. He says the book of Numbers begins with a consensus with a census of the Israelites, hence its name, right? Say Numbers. Okay, I hear that. So so he says the book starts with this counting of the census, right? So Rabbi Sachs is going to ask a series of questions. So first of all, Rabbi Sachs in blessed memory, we're reading his Torah, we're learning his Torah. He should be with us. He should continue to elevate in the heavens for providing us this wisdom. Okay, so he asks a series of questions. Okay, he says, "What is the significance of this act of counting?" Right, that's number one. Right, number second question is why here at the beginning of the book? Right, he says, "Okay, so why here? Like at the beginning of Bar Midbar, right, which is understood as wilderness or desert. But okay, I understand. Like, was it the Greeks or whoever named it numbers or whatever? But the point is just saying that um, why is it that the, the book itself has to start with the counting of the census? Like, what's the significance of that? He says, besides which, there has already been two previous censuses of the people, and this is third within the space of a single year. So there's two other times prior to this that the Jewish people did a census. So why now this third one? Right? And it's not like it's another year, like it's like after the month of Nisan or something, right? He says, additionally, does county have? He says, what does county have anything to do with leadership? So that's a question on himself, right? Because he's writing the whole thing on leadership, right? So he's bringing a point on that, right? So these are great. So these are pretty decent questions, right? These are great questions in this. So the thing I want to I kind of want to focus on just a little bit, right? Is his style of how he's bringing forth this argument. So he's bringing he's starting with a definite statement, right? The book of Numbers begins with the counting of census. Okay, something that's obvious, right? So he creates a premise. I'm talking about the book of this, and I'm highlighting the fact that this is the element, right? So he starts with that, and then so from there he starts asking a series of questions. Now, obviously, he has the answers. He wouldn't be teaching it, right? He wouldn't have anything to say past the questions. He'd say, "Hey, here are my questions, and I need to figure it out." And he'll sit back down, right? So he knows it. So what he's doing is he's asking those questions to the audience, right? Assuming that maybe they do know, maybe they don't know, whatever. But he's doing it. Now, what is that doing? When you ask the question, what are you doing then? What's happening, right? Because like when we were talking about this the other day, and just as a point, when we talk about this idea of thought, thinking, so you asked me, there was a question asked yesterday, which was, should it be idea then think then concept, right? Right? And I have in the past learned it that way, right? Because it reminded me of that. Now the difference now in my thinking process is the fact that when people right before they do something, they say, I have an idea. And then they go and do it. I have an idea, right? Now, If they want to share that idea, someone may ask them, what's the concept? Right? But the concept comes before the idea because the concept is the understanding of the parameters. And that's what makes it a good idea or a bad idea, right? Because like one is, dealing with parameters, because the idea has parameters, it has a structure. So that would say it had to go through a conceptualization process, right? So, but the point is saying that the reason why we started talking about it, because we started to say the concept of the thought, right? We went into thought thinking, a concept and idea, right? But we're talking about the idea of a thought itself. The root of a thought is a reflection of a lack, right? Like you're the way that the mind functions, it starts with a lack, right? Like if you think about anything that you could think about, think about anything you could think about. Like you say you sitting back and you thought about a TV show you watched 10 years ago, right? Now you say, like, where's the lack in that, right? Then you have to ask yourself, well, what is that TV show? What did it represent? What was going on in your life? What was happening, right? Because it's not just a TV show, right? It was an experience, right? And maybe as you dive into those things, you could be able to develop like what that thought of the TV show does for you right now intellectually, what it does for you psychologically, what it does for you emotionally, right? You could do that, right? So the thing is, I always even say with myself, like I remember, when I was younger, I wanted to play quarterback. I mean, I did for a little bit, but ultimately I ended up playing defense in football. But I remember like how much my dad loved. We would watch college football and would be so into it, right? And he had these huge rivalries and these big games, and they had these big superstars. And I saw how much my dad appreciated quarterbacks and those types of things. So I think that was kind of like, looking back on it was kind of like a motivation, right? Now I could look back and then I could have a thought of one of those games that say I watched with my dad, right? Like that thought could just enter my head, right? This play, whatever, this whole thing, he scores a touchdown. But but there's a whole world around that thought, right? There's a whole world of things. So what we're saying is that thought represents something that represents like some type of a lack. It's not negative. I mean, lacks are not negative. This is the root of it. Where the body, the whole structure is rooted in the desire to receive, right? So the basis of the desire to receive is lack, right? We're in the frame of malchut, right? Malchut is about receiving. Receiving only can come from a place of lack, right? And so, and so the thing is, is saying that. So the point is just saying that idea of understanding that this is a frame of lack, then we could analyze the thoughts that we have. We could say, okay, I have a thought, and that thought is not just a free concept, right? That thought is connected to other things, and I want to understand what that thought is because I want to use my thoughts to serve Hashem, right? And those thoughts lead to actions, right? And those actions lead to mitzvahs or veras, God forbid, right? So I want to be able to make sure at a thought level that I can make sure that my service of God is in a place of purity, right? And therefore, if I have a thought, I could maybe the thought is coming from a certain perspective, but I could change the perspective of it, right? I can make that thought pure, right? Which is a whole concept. Like, how do you make your thoughts pure, right? But first, we have to at least understand what the thought is. Like, what is it coming from, right? And then from there, we can see how it progresses, right? Now, the ultimate level is to stop it at the thought level, right? And to ask ourselves, where is this thought coming from? right? Because sometimes we even have thoughts that we just come to our head, right? And we could just start to get upset about it for no reason. Everything's going good. So my point for saying all this is to say what? The way that Rabbi Sachs is building his argument, Chief Rabbi Sachs is building his argument, he's creating a lack in the audience by asking the questions. You understand? And you'll see that common throughout much of Torah literature that much of the time people start the discussion with a question. But the point of starting the discussion with the question is that the speaker is creating a lack. He's creating a space for him to be able to share something, right? Because there has to be a recipient, right? So he comes in and he thinks, like sometimes like at the yeshivas, like you'll have like a rabbi come, he was like, yeah, I have this kasha, I have this question. Everybody, okay, what is it? And he'll sit there. Maybe it's a question he came up with. Maybe it's a question someone else came up. But we want to understand that the question one, and then we want to know the answer, right? So we don't know it. And if he's a smart guy, he's going to pretty much have a good idea on what level he's talking to, and he's going to know what questions we may not have been privy to yet at this point, right? So everyone wants to know that, and the more engaged the audience is, and so that's how he does it. So the point is saying that in order for a person to give over, there has to be a vessel for it, right? And that's why in Judaism we don't believe in proselytizing, right? We don't believe in convincing someone that they need to keep the 613 mitzvahs, which God doesn't even require them to do, right? And if we say, oh, well, this person, is African American, and there's African Americans in the west of Africa that were Jews, and they came over in the transatlantic slave trade, and blah blah blah, the whole thing, right? All right, that's cool too, but I mean, still, like, I mean, okay, there's Europeans, right? There's Africans, there's all types of people that have Jewish descendancy. You know what I'm saying? But there's still a process to acclimating that in a real way, right? But that person that we're talking about is a person that's coming to the Jewish people saying, I want to do this, I want to keep these things, I want to, they're doing that, right? Because in order for a person to receive the light of the Torah, they have to have a desire for it, right? That lack has to be exposed somehow for whatever reason. Maybe it was some type of genetic trigger. Maybe it's a certain type of teaching. Some people say like when righteous people teach Torah, like the words that they teach kind of like envelop themselves in the wind, and so the words that they speak are enveloped in the wind, and they go and they travel the world, and it enters the ears of certain people who have these elevated souls, and then they want to keep the Torah even though they didn't grow up with it, type of thing, right? We call them Gary strangers. But the point is just saying that so that it's a very important principle in general, right? Is that the lack has to be exposed, right? And so when we in our society that we live in, we're going to go back to the text, but the society that we live in has a whole structure of if you're not wealthy, you're less valuable, right? That is the philosophical approach to society. So that means what the standard of wealth is, right? And how it's expressed, is created by a third party, right? Something separate than the wealth, right? So so now so now I'm a human being that's growing up in a society that says the more wealthier you're valuable, and the less wealthier the less valuable you are, right? And there's a whole system of things that perpetuates that thought: the education system, the credit system, various different laws and policies, that, cater to certain, income brackets versus others, because it has to perpetuate itself. So it's a lot of these factors go into how we see reality, right? And so, what we're saying is saying that, we want to be able to take a step back and say like, hey, you know what? What type of self-esteem does a society create that perpetuates this understanding of life, right? Like if you're saying that you create a society that says like, okay, you know what, that you know the more wealthier you are, and the more recognized you are, and the more famous that you are, right? The more valuable of a person you are. And it doesn't matter necessarily how you made your money. It doesn't matter necessarily why you're exactly famous. It doesn't matter exactly, how you spend your money per se. As long as we can recognize that you have achieved wealth and you've achieved fame, and however way you express it becomes like, it's kind of like a trend, right? Because you're worthy of emulating because you've done these things. So like you have, Kim Kardashian, you have to get cosmetic surgery. If you're, you know, Floyd Mayweather, you have to buy a bunch of Bentleys, right? So that's the world that we live in, right? And so the world that we live in, like, how do we understand the functionality of that world on a spiritual level? The understand that world on a spiritual level is to understand that the world that we live in has to create a lack in order to drive people, you have to create a lack. So you have a certain amount of money that you distribute in the marketplace every year, right? And it cycles itself, right? And so based off of where certain people are placed at, whatever, things are completely out of our control, right? You think Bill Gates is rich because he's a genius? No, he was at the right place at the right time. Right? He had the right this operating system at the right time, and his mom got him a meeting at IBM. How did she get him a meeting at IBM? Because she was working at a nonprofit, and so happened one of the heads or the CEO of IBM was also working at the nonprofit, and her son had this kind of like software idea, and she asked him would she at least meet with him to be nice, and so he had this whole concept of this operating system, for hardware. And IBM was in the business of hardware. Was software was not even an industry then. And and he said, okay, yeah, we could maybe use something like that for our thing. He's trying to be nice to the mom. Like trying to hey, we know each other. He'll help a little kid out. Start a little software company. But the thing is, what happened was is that because IBM took on this software, you know, and Bill Gates said to him, he says, "Hey, the only thing we ask for is that we'll license it to you, but we want to be able to license it to other people as well. Because we don't want to just have like one client. This is our only product." And he was like, "Yeah, yeah." The CEO of IBM was like, "Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, we're in a hardware business, we're not a software business." Anyway, because of that one decision, as other companies, other hardware companies, like who are competing with IBM, when they saw that IBM was using Microsoft's disk operating system called DOS, you guys remember that? They said because they knew they were using it, they licensed it with. They did the same thing IBM did and licensed Microsoft software because they're really the only person there really providing it in that way. And the company, that was the beginning of their takeoff. But that was it. There's other people making software. There's other people around at the time. The whole thing, and a series of things. So the point is saying that if you create a lack, right? Like we just saw, like a person asks you a bunch of questions. You go to a lecture, person asks you a question. He's opening you up, right? He's opening you up. Sometimes they may even make a joke before, right? And you laugh, and it's a sense of comfort. We laugh together, And then you ask these questions, right? And so these questions are there to create a lack, right? And then by this lack that it creates, now you're engaged in the process. And so I'm taking that idea that we're talking about that's from the way he wrote this particular, Devar Torah, and I'm comparing that to, you know, the system that we live in, right? Because the system that we live in tells us that if we're not rich, famous, and we don't look a certain way, right? Or we don't dress a certain way, that we're not important, like we're worthless. So how do we reconcile that, right? That's not the world that God created. God didn't create a world that says like if you're not rich and famous, you're worthless. Or the amount or your importance is based off of that. On the opposite, right? God honors the humble. God honors the people who are shy and have to be pushed, to bring their greatness out, right? So like what's going on? And so what we're saying is that we live in a society that's based around different levels of lack, right? Like look at the most wealthy people in our society. Like they have really unique talents, right? Like to be a professional athlete is like a very unique situation, right? To be a model, to be an actress, to be an actor, to be a singer, it's like to be a rapper. You know how many people are rapping, and then how many people actually have a song that's actually played on a national level. Out of all the people that are rapping, you know what percentage that is? And then on top of it, it's people deciding who that one person, who those three people, four people are, right? So the point is just saying. So when you look at the fact that we live in a society that tells us that hey, if you're not these things, you're worthless, right? But at the same time, it creates the mechanism that decides what what these things are and who these people are that perpetuate them. They decide the same thing. So we're born into that reality, and we're like, hey, if I'm not this, these are the rich people here, the A students. No, wait, no, no. They used to do it like this. They had the gifted classes. I don't know if they still have these things. They used to have the gifted classes for the gifted kids, and you had the regular classes, and you had the kids who are kind of like slower and had like learning issues, whatever. And then they're already creating society, right? Just from that, they're creating society. They're saying, hey, the kids who are a little bit slower, they're going to do the blue collar jobs. The kids who are in the middle, they're going to work, in maybe like middle management. And the kids who are the gifted kids are the ones who are the leaders, right? Because they're gifted, right? They're gifted. Wow, they're gifted. You know what that's like? Just like you have a school and you say some of these kids are gifted, and then that means the other kids have to accept that they're not. I mean, this is like cruel stuff. You know what I mean? When you think about it. But the point is just saying that this is the world that we live in. This is the world that we've been raised in. This is the world we've never even really even been taught to question, right? We haven't even been taught to question any of this, right? None of it. This is like so. This is school. This isn't like some conspiracy theory magazine I'm talking about. No, this is school. School is literally training us to do that. And then so now we got to ask ourselves, with that being said, how does that affect our relationship with God, right? Like, do we feel worthy to be loved by God, to accept that we are loved by God? Because being loved by God is a complete rejection of the entire system, right? The whole system of A student, B student, C student, D, F, gifted class, regular class, slow class, smart, kind of all these different things that they have created in society. And we haven't even dealt with race yet, right? We haven't even talked about race. I'm just dealing with the intellect of the Western child that becomes an adult, right? And so he looks at himself, she looks at himself in the same way, The way that the report card judged us is the same way we judge ourselves, right? Hence cosmetic surgery, right? And so, or the beauty industry, right? And so that's this concept. So that's what we're working off of, is that, and to be able to look at the world around us and say like, wow, the whole system is really trying to convince me of a matrix that they came up with. Like, it's nothing even godly about their matrix. Like, the whole thing is like intellectual cruelty. It's like you take a kid on a given day that takes a test, and because he takes a test or she takes a test, you determine their whole life based off of that score. You place them in certain groups, you tell them certain things about themselves, and then they grow up believing these things. Right? And then not only that, they usually have the same expectations for their own children. This is the way it is, you know. But the point of this thing, so but the idea is is to be able to really challenge that thinking process that I have about myself, right? And we're going to go back into Rabbi Sachs, but it's just an important thing because I wanted to really touch on this desire concept and how desire can be created within someone, right? Or a group of people, right? Like, look at all these great like speakers and like you know, we call them dictators, I guess, some of them, right? But this listen to how they talk to others. And what I'm saying to you is that's the same world, the way the world has been talking to us since we've been a kid. It's created a whole matrix about who we are, what we're capable of, you know, what we're good at, what we're not good at, you know, and it's all connected to this external reality and has nothing to do with our individuality or uniqueness on a soul level. They reject it, right? And so like what we're working through now is getting back to that place where we could remove all those ideas, right? We could really say like, what would it be like if all these really, I mean, like, think about it, like, well, you're not an A student. Who cares? It's a standardized education. It's a general education. It's one size fit all. You give us all the same book and you judge us on which one of us are good at this book. Come on, are you kidding me? That's education? You put 30 people in a room, you give them the same book, and the people who respond to this book a certain way are A students, and the people who kind of don't get it kind of are B, and oh no. From this book, what do you mean? Right? Jeez. Right? What do you mean? Right? So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Chief Rep, I was going to say that, it starts off in the classroom with just like the teachers and they are like making like assessments of the children. And from their assessments, they start to do this pool of separation of the students. And so, like you said, using the word gifted, these are the gifted children here, and these are the children who, are considered to be average or below average, just all of these different labels that are given to the put on the children. And throughout their entire education career, it just kind of stays like that. Like when does that average student ever get the opportunity to be the gifted student, even if they make the grade, makes the marks? But it's like they have a set group that's picked pretty early on, almost like at the beginning of middle school, leaving elementary, and then they stay that course. And so it's like you're in your own little society of educate. You're your own society. But what's really interesting to me is that that's like inside the school, that's like with the teachers, that's like amongst the students and so forth or whatnot. And of course, the parents, they know if their children are gifted and so forth. But then when it comes to graduation, Now we have to let everybody know, all of the neighbors who might get invited to come see, little John graduate or this one and so forth. The community comes and they fill out the building. Now the gifted students all get a different color robe.
No.
The gifted students get a different color robe because
This is
they're
crazy.
gifted.
This
And
is
then
crazy.
all the other children who just made it, they met the standard. They get another robe. And it's like, we do not see that, we just, it's just, and you know what? I'm gonna tell you, that's one of the things that I really love about, learning more and more about Judaism is before I saw all of the biblical characters, Chief Rabbi, as just like, oh, they're just so great. They never had, this, that, and the other. But actually digging in more and more to like the commentary and the readings of the sages and so forth, it's like, what? Rabbi Akiva's these great men, they had an issue with not being able to, not be so hard. It's like, really, everybody has their different, struggles, but why do we single out the, when it comes to education? So anyways, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, and the thing is on that, and that point is to say, I mean, this is like really like cruelty, you know what I mean? And it's just so important to really critique society in this way because I was just thinking about I wish I would have saved it, but I saw a great statement by this pianist, right? He's a guy, I can't think of his name, some like, European type guy, and he's supposed to be the greatest classical pianist of all time. And they asked him, like, how do you feel when people say you're the greatest classical pianist? And he said, it really makes me angry. He's like, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it. He says, like, basically it's a desecration to art. He says, it's like, how can you compare one person's art to another person's art? Art is expression, right? So how can you say that? How can you compare any art at any time in any generation to anything else? Because it's just different expressions, and it says expressions that you have access to, right? And so he was saying that what you could say about art or artists is that it's very different. It's different, you know, and that difference is part of its uniqueness, right? And so And so, uh, I just did this interview. This is like the fastest turnaround I've ever seen in my life on it. All right, so okay, yeah. So anyway, so the point is just saying like this is the point is to say like this is the point is to say like this is just it's just saying that this is what it is to challenge and to learn Torah, right? Because if the Torah is our reality and that's the basis of how we see everything, then that means I have to look at everything else that everyone else is saying in that same way. Like, how does this fit into the system of Torah? So now when you start isolating people because they learn books differently, you know what I mean? Or they respond to this particular classroom or this particular, air condition, I mean, it could be any, you know what I'm saying? And it's just like, and you're creating that environment, and then you're doing that intentionally to create a psychological class system where certain people go after certain types of jobs, which leads to living certain neighborhoods, which creates what you call an economy, right? If everybody wanted to be the CEO, who would do the shipping, right? Now they're saying you don't need that. Now they got robots, right? But the point is just saying that this is this is the world that we live in, and what I'm saying is saying that when we look at it in that perspective, then we have to say, hey, I've been looking at myself and everyone around me in the same way. From an A, B, C, D, F level. And we've been gauging life in that way. We've been looking at ourselves, our efforts in life, our physical, everything about ourselves. We've been critiquing in everything around us because we live in a consumer society. So we grade everything. We're like good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, right? Like everything is in these like class categories, right? And some things rightfully so. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't have anything, don't have any structures. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that understanding that how I see the world has been shaped by a society that wants to have mass production and mass acquisition, and that people who live in that system have to be massively stimulated to be able to do that, right? Right? Massively stimulated to be able to do that, right? And so and so and so and so that becomes a way of thinking, right? And so that idea of not connecting to the soul or the soul consciousness, right? Not being able to connect to the soul consciousness in that reality, coupled with the fact that you have a society that's functioned on this mass production and this mass acquisition and stimulating everyone within that system to do that way, to work really hard and buy a lot of stuff, right? And so therefore the American people are the biggest consumers in the world, right? Right, which means everyone who makes products and services around the world, they want a part of the American economy, right? Because they want to. They, I mean, they buy everything. These people, they're buying insane. They're insanity. They just want to buy, and work and buy, and that's it. And get richer and richer and famous and famous. That's what they want to do. Okay, so I want to sell there too. So that makes America powerful. That's what Trump's tariffs are about. If you want to sell your products in America, because our people are indoctrinated to buy product and to work hard to buy them, right? If you want to be a part of our consumer insanity, you have to do some of your manufacturing in America, right? You got to do part of your business in America. You got to provide Americans with jobs, based off of your vocation. That's what the tariffs are. But the point is, the root of why the tariffs works is because the American individual defines themselves on what they're able to purchase. Okay? That's why the purse makes matter. That's why the car matters so much. That's why the watch matters so much. That's why the chain now everyone just walking around with like $80,000 chains. That's like the new thing now, right? I mean, at least it is on TV. I mean, I don't see it in Israel. I'm saying I'm looking at things in America. It's like every show, everyone's wearing these like $100,000 chains. Yeah, it's like 60 racks. I'm like, where'd you get 60 racks from? You know how much land you could buy with 60 racks around the world? Anyways, so the point is just saying, so those are just some reflection points to really think about, because it's like that's a big concept. And this is a indoctrination that's happening 24 hours, all day, every day, all around us. And the thing is, a lot of times, like people, get information and they're like, I have to go out, I'm going to tell everybody. But you know what? If people don't have a vessel for it, they don't care. However, you can use it to your advantage, right? The individual could be able to see society for what it portrays itself, but still be able to understand society or the world for as it really is. Right? So I'm learning Torah to learn how the world actually is. The society that I live in is perpetuating the world as they would like us to believe it is. And that's why the Torah in the world, or in the way the world functions, are in contradiction. Right? The Torah says modesty, the world says ill modesty. The Torah says kosher, the world says eat whatever you want. right? And you could just go on and on and on in many, many categories, right? And so that's the issue, right? That's the issue, is that we live in a world that contradicts the Torah. But okay, it's supposed to. Why would you want a world that agreed with the Torah? Where would you be able to express your free will? You would if the world agreed with the Torah, we would beg for the opportunity. We'll beg for Hashem to have a moment or a couple moments in our life where we could use our free will, so we could choose Hashem. So anyway, so that's where we're at, and that's a separation. That's learning the Torah. Is I see the world a certain way, and they see the world a certain way. And my job is that I'm in diaspora. I'm in exile. These people aren't going to necessarily like the way that I see the world, but I have to engage with them enough that I can maintain my existence, and my children can maintain their existence, but up until the point that everyone goes back to Israel and is there with Mashiach, right? So that's what I'm doing. I'm interacting with the world that's for sure 100% against me, for sure in the Sitra Akra, for sure rooted in evil, and lies and sweat. The whole That's what the world is. So I got to interact with that world. I still got to interact with that world, right? And so that's where the halacha comes in. Is how do we deal with everything? How do we deal with other people from other nations? How do we do business? How do we, rent property, whatever. The point is saying that's right. So let's go back into Rabbi Sachs. But yeah, but this is a high level Torah, because it's we have to create a mechitza, a separation between us and the world, right? We're cool with the world. We're not mad at them. We're just saying, you guys see it one way. We think we get our fulfillment from the energies, the stuff you guys can't see and you guys don't have microscopes for. At least you tell us you don't, right? Okay, all right. So he says the place to begin is to note what looks like a contradiction. On one hand, Rashi says that the act of counting in the Torah is a gesture of love on the part of God. So he's saying there's some issue here of understanding about the counting. He said there's some type of a contradiction that's about to come to counting. So he brings Rashi, and Rashi talks about counting in the frame of counting being a good gesture. He says, because the children of Israel are dear to him, God counts them often. He counts them when they are about to leave Egypt. And he says, and he counted them after the golden calf to establish how many were left, and how that he was about to, cause his presence to rest with them, with the inauguration of the sanctuary. And he says, and he counted them again. So this is Rashi speaking on this particular pasuk that speaks about the counting of the Israelites, right? The census, right? So that's what he says. He says when God, when God, it pretty much when God initiated the census of the Israelites is to show them how much he says how much he loves them, right? So when God initiates the census to the Israelites is showing how much God loves them, right? He says, but on the other hand, the Torah is explicit in saying that taking a census of the nation is fraught with risk. Then God said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each must give to God a ransom for his life at the time he's counted. Then no plague will come to him when you number them. So he's saying, like, the counting of the census and them contributing has something to do with removing some judgment. He says then centuries later, King David counted the people there as divine anger and in severity, thousands of people. He says. Sorry. He said centuries later, King David also did a census, and he says, and there was divine anger involved, right? And 70,000 people died. It says in Samuel 2 and Chronicles 1. He says, how can this be counting? He says, how could this be if counting is an expression of love? All right, so you got the question, right? So he says, on the opening verse, when they're talking about Moses doing the counting of the Israelites, Rashi comments and he talks about it in the frame of how much God loves the Israelites, and the counting is a sign of that. So that's why he's starting the book of from Rashi's perspective, that the reason why God is starting with this verse in Bamidbar, he has this verse in Bamidbar, and he's saying the reason why God's starting this verse in Bamidbar about the census and the counting is because Hashem loves the Jewish people, and that's why he did the counting, right? So Rabbi Sachs comes, he says, if that's so, why is it that if you're saying that God counting the Jewish people as expression of love, here's some other examples in Exodus and in Samuel's 2, right? That shows that actually is connected, that counting could be connected to judgment, right? To dealing with divine anger. And so that's his question. So how do we understand Rashi? Right? That's really in essence what he's saying. How do we understand this concept of love? He said the answer lies in the phrase the Torah uses to describe the counting, the act of counting, siut rosh, literally to lift the head. He says this is a strange I don't know, secular expression. He says the Hebrew. He said the biblical Hebrew contains many verbs meaning count. Okay, so he says limnat, lifkod, lispar, levush, lehashvush, lehashvu. I don't know. Anyway, so he says, trying to understand Hebrew words in English is always weird. He says, what does the Torah not, he says, why does the Torah not use these simple words, choosing instead of a roundabout expression, lift the heads of the people? So he says the word itself, counting, it says seud et rosh. He says it literally says lift the heads. So he's saying it's a weird word. He says why not just be more, if it's about counting, why not just use the word itself? Why not use a more simple word for counting? Why this lifting of the head concept, lift the head concept, right? Right. He says why does the Torah not use a simpler words, choosing instead of a roundabout expression like lift the heads of the people? He said the answer is short. You see how he keeps asking you the question, and you build that desire, and then how he feeds you, right? The desire feeding, desire feeding. And he says this is life, right? This is Hashem. He says the short answer is this. He says any census count or roll call, there is a tendency to focus on the total, the crowd, the multitude, the masses. He says here is a nation of 60 million people, or a company with 100,000 employees, or a sports crowd of 60,000 fans. Many totals tends to value the group or nation as a whole. The larger the total, the stronger the army. The more popular the team, the more successful the company. He says counting devalues the individuals. Counting devalues the individuals and tends to make him or her replaceable. If one soldier dies in battle, another will take his place. If one person leaves the organization, some people can be hired to do to do his or her job. He says notoriously too, crowds have the effect of tendencies to make the individual lose his or her independent judgment and follows what others are doing, as we have noted before. We call this herd behavior. So he's talking about this idea of, groupthink in essence, right? And he says it is sometimes lead to collective madness. He says in 1841, Charles Mackay published a classic study called The Extraordinarily Popular Delusion and the Madness of the Crowd, which tells of the South Sea bubble that cost thousands their money in the 1720s. My apologies. He says in the two he says the tulip mania in Holland, when fortunes were spent on single tulips, Bubbings. He says the great crash of 1929 and 2008 had the same crowd psychology. So I guess these were times where there's like some type of like hype, some type of hysteria, and everyone went out and just acted kind of like not logically, kind of like what we were talking about, normal society. He says another great work is Gavston B. Bon, or whatever, The Crowd, the Study of Popular Mind. He says it shows. This is in 1895. He shows how crowds exercise a magnetic influence that transmutes and behaviors of individuals into collective mind group. Interesting. And he says, and he put it in individuals in a crowd is a grain of sand, other grains of sand, which the wind whirls up at will. People in the crowd become anonymous. Their conscience is silenced. He says, and they lose a sense of personal responsibility. He says the crowds are particularly prone to regressive behavior, primitive retractions, and centrical behavior. He says these are easily led by figures who are demagogues playing on the fears and the sense of victimhood. So this is kind of like what we're talking about, right? So he says such leaders, he says, are expressly recruited from the ranks of those morbidly nervous, excitable, half-deranged persons who are bordering on madness. A remarkable anticipation of Hitler, and it is no accident that Lee Braun's work was published in France at the same time of the rising of anti-Semitism in the Dreyfus trials. All right. So he says, so he's saying this idea of, you talk about this idea of the group, right? And this idea of the group in within groups, like people like tend to lose their identity and they kind of like become a part of group think. And this group think, becomes a culture, right? And people are just drawn into it because there's something that happens psychologically with people within groups. So he says, hence the significance of one remarkable feature of Judaism, its principles in sense like no other civilizations before, on the dignity and integrity of the individual. We believe that every human being is in the image and likeness of God. The sages say that every life is like the entire universe, says Nemesis Sanhedrin. He says Rambam says that each of us should see ourselves as if our next act could change the fate of the world. And every dissenting view is carefully recorded in the Mishnah. even if the law is otherwise. In every verse of the Torah is capable, is capable, and said the sages of the 70 interpretations. He says, no voice, no view is silent. Judaism never allows us to lose our individuality in the mass. So he's saying, like, so it's interesting. So he brings this idea and he talks about group and group think and how the concepts of group marginalizes the individual. It makes them kind of like succumb, this whole thing. So now it's kind of interesting when this idea of counting is coming in now. Right, that's why I hear he's going with this. Is that like no? It's not just like the group came together and he counted them. No, there's a significance to this. It's saying that there's a concept that exists in society where when groups come together, people lose their identity. So where I think he's going, and I should probably let him do it, is I think he's going to go into the significance of being counted. He says it is a wonderful blessing mentioned in the Talmud to be said on seeing 600,000 Israelites together in one place. He said it's a blessing. He said that is blessed are you, our Lord who discerns secrets. He said the Talmud explains that every person is different. And we each have different attributes, and we all think our own thoughts, and only can we enter the minds of each of us and know what we are thinking, and this is what is blessing refers to. In other words, even in an enormous crowd where the human eyes face blurs into a mass, God still relates to us as individuals. He says it is the meaning of the phrase "lift the head" and use to the context of a census. Tell tell Moses that there is a danger. Okay, so I just kind of was going. So this kind of like flow with this for a second. So it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, right? Is exactly what we were talking about earlier, right? With this whole idea that the Talmud says, and it obviously, comes to the Torah. If we went inside, we can see how, we can get it from all these different sources inside and ways to understand it. But the Talmud says clearly that every human being is unique. And every human being has a unique attribute. It has a unique contribution and a unique dynamic. Now, the only reason why the Talmud can make a statement like that, because the Talmud believes that every human being has a soul. Now, if we deal with the society that we live in, the mainstream society that we live in, that separates church and state, and they're doing it, I believe, with good intentions. But the point is that the framework of religion is something that the government and the government-based institutions, which is our public education, does not coincide with, right? It doesn't coincide with it, because if they talk about the soul, that is like teaching religion by them, right? And so they teach the opposite, right? And not only that, the concept of groupthink is exactly how styles and trends are created, right? Not just with clothes, with eating, stocks, real estate, business, everything, investment trends. What is a trend? A trend is groupthink, right? So this is what we're up against in society. And I'm not saying, oh, it's some evil conspiracy to keep us. No, I'm just saying, no, this is the imperfected reality. And so they came to the conclusion that, hey, as long as we keep religion out of the institutions of the state, that we will be able to cater to all different types. I get it. However, that means that the information perpetuated by the institutions also has to be devoid of that, right? Which means there's a perspective on reality that's missing, right? And so this is the reality that we grew up in, right? And so that's why you could have a situation where you could have, hey, gifted kids and regular kids, and they separate them, right? And what is the premise of that? A particular book, a particular set of teachers up to that point. All right. So that go ahead.
Yes, I was going to ask Chief Rabbi, when we think about this here, and we think about it in relates to with David and all of the people, they started dying because he did this census, right? But he was not following, the book. He wasn't following the commands that Hashem had put in place in order to do the census. So when I think about that, it's like, okay, so you're just counting people, just like to count people, just like counting, and just but Hashem, when he laid out the guidelines, I know it was something like about, the people would actually bring, their shekel or whatever to be for the shekel to actually be counted. And so that kind of almost that really makes me think like you're a part, like you're giving your contribution, you're significant, you matter, because I don't know exactly what you have to do to obtain that half shekel, but you're saying, I did it, I got it, or whatever, even if you had to ask someone for it, or work for it or whatever, but you have it and you come and you feel a part. And it made me think about how all of the numbers, like even for like the for uh the people that were transported from the west coast of Africa to America, or the Holocaust and so forth, like these numbers, like where did they get these numbers from, that this is how many people were in these different situations? It just really just makes me think like, just counting people, just putting people into groups, just separating, just doing that sort of thing, that Hashem, he is so, it just makes me think about how just so beautiful, and how loving he is, like it's an act of love, like we talked about at the beginning. But also it can be, if not done the way he wants it to be done, it could be a hardship.
Yeah, no, you're right on with that, and so yeah, that's the idea. And so what, on the King David point, definitely there was different dynamics on why the judgment was going on there, but nevertheless, the point that Chief Rabbi Sachs was pointing out, he's going on one specific point, which is in the beginning of this Torah portion. Rashi talks about the counting, and he refers to it as an act of love. And when God counts the Jewish people, he's doing it as an act of love. And so he brings two other examples where there was times of judgment and there was accounting, right? Why was there judgment? What was going on at the time? The whole thing. Did the judgment have something to do with the King David's actions, or the people actions, or both of their actions? Yeah, that's a whole thing. But we do see that it wasn't a time of love, right? And so whether it was King David's fault or whoever's fault it was, if it was only an act of love, it wouldn't have happened then. And so that's the point that he's going off of and saying like, okay, well, how could it be in that way? And so he's saying so where he's going with it so far is that he's explaining the different dynamic with the group versus, I guess, the aspect of individualism, right? Because he just got finished talking about that, and that's why it's just so important to really evaluate things from a Torah perspective. Because, like, again, like on something basic, like, I mean, not basic, something humongous like education, it says specifically here. It says, he says there's a wonderful blessing. He says there's a wonderful blessing mentioned in the Talmud to be said on seeing 600,000 Jews in one place, right? It is blessed are you, Hashem, who discern secrets, right? Okay. He said the Talmud explains that every single person is different, right? Each has a different attribute. Now, if the Talmud is saying this, and we have a school system that does not understand, does not believe, does not practice this, I'm sure if we asked the teacher, they would agree. He says, we think in our own thoughts. Only God can enter the minds of each of us and know what we are thinking. And this is what the blessing refers to. In other words, even in an enormous crowd where when the human eyes face blur into the masses, God still relates us to as individuals. He said, "This is the meaning of the phrase lift your head." When used in the context of a census, God tells Moses that there is a danger when counting a nation, that each individual will feel insignificant. What am I? What difference can I make? I'm only one amongst a million, a mere wave in the ocean, a grain on of sand on the seashore, dust in the surface of infinity. And he says again that God tells Moses to lift people's heads by showing that they each count and they matter and as individuals. Indeed, Jewish law is a devar shebamayim. He says something is counted, sold individually rather than by weight. Interesting. He says, is never nullified even in the mixture of 1,000 or 1 million offerings, says in Beta. In Judaism, taking a census must always be done in such a way as to signal that we are all valued as individuals. He says, we each have a unique gift, and there is a contribution only I can bring. To lift someone's head means to show them favor, to recognize them. It is a gesture of love. So that's a very interesting thing, And so the thing is, I think that's one of the things that I really believed, like looking back on my life in retrospect, right? I think my mom being an education advocate and her exposing, always talking about the problems in education and this and education, I never took it personal that I wasn't like so academically successful. You know what I mean? Like my siblings were very much more much more successful in school than I was. But I think looking back on it, I always looked at it like school had the problem. It wasn't me, right? But now that I'm even older and I'm learning like some of the deepest wisdom, it's even more apparent, right? And I think that self-esteem molding, that school is does, that's why, I mean, a lot of people like yourself, other people do homeschooling for this reason, because the self-esteem of the kid is just destroyed. It's all shaped, the whole thing, and it's not right. And when you think about that, and that's the other point I wanted to really. This is the other point I want to really focus on in this point, is this idea of when you look at the say the average person in the collective, average person living, average woman, and we're talking about never have questioned anything, completely created and structured by K through 12 education, completely structured by the media, completely structured by let's assume there's some religious dynamic, but they're structured by that. Now, all those institutions, right, are all connected to the same source, which is government, right? And government has this philosophy. So you're not going to hear things that are going to necessarily disrupt, right, type of things. And so the point is the point is um, the point is just is to look at those two people when they come together and when they connect to each other, right? The whole thinking is external. And so they come together, and then will you just look at the process of how the human being is created, the consciousness of which the human being is created, from K through 12 through, from college, to the workforce, right? To maybe creating a nuclear home and a set of desires and motivations, right? Like Super Bowl weekend's a real thing, right? Like a lot of people watch it. Like, what does that represent, right? What does that mean when, like, was it 50 million, something like this? I don't know. It could be more. I have no idea. Like, what does that represent? That means there's millions of people that bought into the system, right? Because the system recreated like new holidays, new connections, right? New connection points, new unity points. Everyone's connected, right? Super Bowl, like Super Bowl Sunday, right? Everyone goes out. They may get their jerseys. They got the pizza, they got the beer, they're barbecuing this, the whole thing, right? So it's just something to just be aware of, and I know it's kind of like, I'm not trying to like separate the world consciousness, but I'm just saying, like, I mean, like, this is what it is, right? Like, this is the world's completely upside down on the outside, and it looks attractive, right? Those Moabian women that they sent to the Jews, they were attractive, weren't they? Right? Destroyed all of them, brought them all the plagues. Okay, let's finish up Rabbi Sachs. Okay, Bar Midbar, whoever thought it'd be so deep. All right, let's go. All right, let's go. Okay, okay, everyone's unique. He says there is, however, all the differences in the world between individuality and individualism. Individuality means that I am unique and the valued member of the team. Individualism means that I am not a team player at all. Interesting. He says, I am interested in myself alone and not the group. He says, Harvard psychologist Robert Putnam, whatever, gave this a famous name. Nothing that is more than ever in the United States are going to. All right, what he's going to say. All right, so he says he gave this a famous name. What's the famous name that he gave him? He says nothing that more people than than ever in the United States are going to pin down 10 pin 10 pin bowling, but fewer than ever are joining teams. Okay, so I get what he's saying. So he's saying this idea. So I guess he's comparing individualism to into being individuality. So he says more people than ever are going to play. They're going bowling, right? Because I guess bowling, you're kind of like more of an individual. And he says within a collective, right? But fewer than ever are joining teams. So he's saying people aren't joining the teams concepts, are looking for more individualistic expressions in competition. He says he calls it the bowling alone. That's what he calls it. He says MIT professor Sherry Truckhill calls our age of Twitter, Facebook, and electronics rather than face-to-face friendship. He says alone together. I like that. Judaism in values individuality, but not individualism. As the famous Hillel says, if I am not for myself, then who am I? I think we're almost done. Yeah, we're almost done. Just battle it through. We're almost there. All right. So he says all this has implications for Jewish leadership. He says, we are not in the business of counting numbers. The Jewish people are always was small and yet achieved great things. Judaism is profound mistrust of the demagogue leaders who manipulate the emotions of the crowds. Moses at the burning bush spoke of his inabilities to be eloquent. I am not a man of words. He says he thought this was a failing in leadership. In fact, it was the opposite. Moses did not always sway people with his oratory. Rather, he lifted them by his teachings. He says a Jewish leader has to respect individuals. He or she must lift their heads. However, however large the group, however large the group you lead, you must always communicate the values you place on everyone, including those others. He said those others included the widow, the orphan, the stranger. You must never attempt to sway a crowd by appealing to the primitive emotions of fear or hate. He says you must never ride roughshod over the opinions of others. He said this is hard to lead a nation of individuals, but this is the most challenging, overpowering, inspiring leadership of all. Perfect. Any reflections on that? This is Venture.
This is very, very good. Very, very good. Toda Rabbi for
Yeah.
this year. It was very, very good. Very informative and just keeps you, just not looking at things the way, society has tried to get us to look at and formulate any type of opinion or thought about it, but just to keep the mindset into Torah and how we should view things. It's a whole mindset shift. Toda.
Amen, amen. And one last point you just made me think about. So one last point is just to say, even with dealing with kids and this whole thing, it's just like they have to be aware of these influences that are coming at them and what these influences are trying to teach them and trying to allure them on. Because when you really think about it, right, on a certain level, low self-esteem is the belief in the external self. Because if you only believe in the external self, you're only going to think in group think. You're not an individual. So if you're only in a frame of group think, your self-perception is controlled by the collective. If you're holding by individuality, which is the neshama, then that means that you have something unique to contribute to everyone else. And there's no higher self-esteem than that. That just being myself is my greatest accomplishment. Speaking in my truth, living in my truth, living my way is no higher accomplishment. Now in groupthink, the greatest accomplishment is set by the curve system, right? Whoever scored the highest. I got to be like them. And whatever conditions that allow them to score highest is relevant because I have to deal with it from my frame. And so now my self-esteem is being